There are things in this world that no one wants to inherit. A name ruined by scandal is one. A debt that follows you like a second shadow is another. But in the high country of western Montana in the autumn of 1889, the most unwanted inheritance of all was a piece of wind. They called it the Gray Widowmaker, and they spoke its name with the kind of reverence most folks reserve for a hanging judge or the wrath of the Almighty. It was not a breeze. It was not a gust. It was a force of geological indifference, a relentless, soul-scouring current that poured down from the northern peaks like cold water through a cracked dam, and it stripped the warmth from stone and bone and everything that dared to stand upright in its path. Clara Mercer knew this wind the way a sailor knows the sea that took his brother. She felt it in the marrow of her teeth, in the ache behind her eyes, in the way her body had learned to lean forward even when standing still, bracing against an assault that never fully stopped. The wind was her truest inheritance, more so than the worthless scrap of paper in her coat pocket. More so than the debts her dead husband had left like landmines buried across every conversation she would have for the rest of her natural life. The wind and the debt. The debt was a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the wind was the cold that seeped through it, and together they made a kind of misery so complete it felt almost architectural, as though someone had designed it specifically for her. Emmett Mercer had been dead for 11 days when they auctioned off the contents of the life he had built with her. He had been a man of grand dreams and shallow pockets, a combination as dangerous in the Montana Territory as a loaded pistol in the hands of a child. He had arrived in her life with laughter and ambition and a smile that could convince you the sun rose because he asked it to, and he had left it on a dark mountain road thrown from a horse, on a night when the rain turned the trail to grease and the darkness swallowed everything, including the sound of his body hitting the rocks 40 feet below the switchback. They did not find him for 2 days. A hunter following elk tracks stumbled across the horse first, standing with a broken rein near a stand of lodgepole pine, and then found what was left of Emmett Mercer at the bottom of the ravine, his neck at an angle that told the whole story without a single word. The cruelest detail was not the death itself, but the silence that preceded the discovery. Clara had waited at home for 2 nights, stoking the fire, watching the door, telling herself he had stayed in town because of the weather, because the pass was too dangerous, because Emmett was reckless, but not stupid. She told herself these things while some deeper part of her, some animal instinct that lived below language, already knew. When the county sheriff finally rode up to her porch hat in his hands, she noticed 2 things simultaneously. The first was the careful arrangement of sympathy on his weathered face. The second was that Harlan Mercer, Emmett's older brother, was not with him. Harlan, who lived 3 miles closer to town. Harlan, who would have been told first. Harlan, who had known for a full day before anyone thought to ride out and inform the widow. That small, precise cruelty was the seed of everything that followed. The auction took place in the yard of the house Clara had shared with Emmett. A modest clapboard structure with a porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, and a kitchen where she had once believed she would raise children. The auctioneer was a thin man from Helena with a voice like a rusted hinge, and he moved through the inventory of her marriage with the brisk efficiency of a man selling livestock. The rocking chair Emmett had sat in every evening, reading aloud from newspapers that were already 2 weeks old by the time they reached the valley. Sold for $2 to the Hendricks family from the next farm over. The set of copper-bottom pots she had received as a wedding gift from her mother. The ones she had used to cook the first meal of her married life, a simple stew that Emmett had declared the finest thing he had ever tasted. Sold for $1.50 to a woman Clara did not recognize. The quilt her grandmother Lenora had sewn by hand. Each square a piece of fabric from a different year of her life on the Kansas plains. A textile autobiography that spanned 4 decades of drought and hope and survival. Sold for 75 cents to the minister's wife who had the decency to look ashamed. Each item that left carried a specific memory, sharp and precise as a shard of broken glass. And Clara stood at the edge of her own yard, watching the fragments of her existence pass into other hands. She did not cry. She had used up her tears in the first 3 days after the sheriff's visit, spending them the way Emmett had spent money, recklessly and completely, until there was nothing left. What replaced the tears was something harder and less familiar, a kind of clarity that comes only when every comfortable illusion has been stripped away. She saw things now with a brutal, unadorned sharpness. She saw the pity in her neighbor's eyes and recognized it for what it was: not compassion, but distance, the instinctive withdrawal of people who fear that misfortune might be contagious. She saw the careful way they handled her possessions, as though the objects themselves were contaminated by failure. And she saw Harlan. He stood at the back of the small crowd, arms folded across a chest that strained the buttons of his expensive waistcoat, and he did not bid on a single item. This was a man who had never in his life passed up an opportunity to acquire something at a discount. He was 45 years old, prosperous in the way that certain men in small towns are prosperous. His wealth measured not in great sums, but in the accumulation of small advantages: a water right here, a timber claim there, a handshake deal with the right county official at the right moment. He had none of Emmett's charm and all of the Mercer family's grasping practicality, and he stood there in the autumn wind watching the auction of his dead brother's household with an expression that Clara could not quite read. It was not grief. It was not satisfaction. It was patience. The particular calculating patience of a man who is waiting for the main event, having already dismissed the preliminaries as irrelevant. He was not interested in pots and quilts. He was interested in something else entirely, and the fact that he was willing to stand in the cold for 2 hours without bidding told Clara more about her situation than any conversation could have. When the last item was sold and the auctioneer packed up his ledger, and the neighbors drifted away with their purchases balanced on wagon beds and slung over saddles, Clara was left with three things: a small wooden chest containing Emmett's personal effects, his pocket watch, his straight razor, a bundle of letters she had not yet been able to read, her own worn clothes packed in a canvas bag, and a deed. The deed was for a parcel of land high on the stony shoulder of the mountain, a place the locals called Goat's Folly. It was a patch of earth so notoriously barren, so savagely exposed to the widowmaker, that for 2 generations it had served as the punchline to every joke about bad investments in the county. The land had belonged to Emmett's uncle, a man named Clara Mercer, who had been as stubborn and unforgiving as the rock itself. Old Croft had lived alone on the mountain for 30 years, convinced that the land held some secret worth guarding, and he had died alone there too, frozen in the ruins of his shepherd's bothy during the blizzard of '76. The land had passed to Emmett through a will that read more like a curse, and now it had passed to Clara, a legacy of stone and wind and the collective ridicule of everyone in the valley below. She walked up to see it the day after the auction. The path was little more than a suggestion, a faint thread of packed earth that wound through gorse bushes and skeletal heather, climbing steeply through a landscape that grew progressively more hostile with every 100 yards of elevation. The trees thinned and twisted, bending away from the prevailing wind like old men recoiling from a blow. The grass gave way to rock. The soil, where it existed at all, was a thin, grudging skin stretched over the granite bones of the mountain. And the wind, the ever-present widowmaker, tore at her shawl and whipped her hair across her face, and pushed against her chest with the flat, impersonal force of a hand that did not care whether she fell. The land itself was a testament to nature's total indifference to human ambition. Granite outcrops broke through the surface like the ribs of some enormous buried animal. The heather was gray and brittle, already dying back for winter. In the center of the parcel stood the ruins of old Croft's bothy, a tumble of moss-covered stones that looked as though a giant had kicked it over in a fit of petulance. The walls had collapsed inward, filling the small interior with rubble. One corner still stood to a height of about 4 feet, a jagged remnant that served only to give the wind a surface to howl around. The roof was gone entirely, its timbers rotted or blown away years ago. There was no shelter here, only a more concentrated sense of decay, a monument to the particular kind of failure that comes from fighting a battle you were never meant to win. Clara stood in the center of the ruins and turned slowly in a full circle. To the north, the peaks rose white and indifferent. To the south, the valley spread out below the town, a cluster of dark shapes against the tawny grassland. Smoke rising from chimneys in thin threads that the wind shredded before they could reach the sky. This was hers, this pile of broken stone and hostile earth. The final bitter joke of a life that had promised so much and delivered so little. Harlan was waiting for her at the bottom of the path when she came down. He had not been there when she started the climb, which meant he had come specifically to intercept her, had perhaps been watching from a distance, timing her descent. He stood beside his horse with his hands in his coat pockets, his hat pulled low against the wind, and his face wore an expression of practiced sympathy that did not reach his eyes. Those eyes were looking past her up at the barren slope above, with a quality of attention that had nothing to do with concern for a grieving sister-in-law. His voice carried the oily smoothness of a man delivering a speech he had rehearsed. "Let me take this burden from you, Clara. A woman alone has no business upon that rock. Sell me the deed, take the money, go back east to your people before the first snow falls. The mountain doesn't care for grief, and that land will eat you alive." He produced a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket, a written offer, the figure so insultingly small it would have barely fed her for a month. He held it out with the air of a man extending a lifeline. Clara looked at the paper, then at Harlan's face, then at his hands. His left hand, the one not holding the offer, was pressed flat against his coat, pushing something deeper into the inner pocket. The outline of it was visible through the wool. A roll of documents, perhaps letters or maps, hastily concealed when he noticed her gaze. His eyes shifted just for a fraction of a second, the involuntary flicker of a man caught reaching for something he should not have. She looked at his offer one more time. Then she folded it in half and handed it back to him without opening it. "I'm staying." The change in Harlan's face was the most informative thing she had seen in weeks. A man performing charity, genuinely trying to help a widow in distress, would have sighed and wished her well and ridden away with his conscience clear. Harlan did none of these things. His jaw tightened. The muscles around his eyes contracted. His nostrils flared with a single sharp intake of breath. It was the face of a man who had just been denied something he wanted, not something he was generously trying to give away. The expression lasted perhaps 2 seconds before he smoothed it over with a shrug and a thin smile. But those 2 seconds told Clara everything she needed to know. This land, this worthless, ridiculed, wind-blasted patch of nothing that everyone in the valley laughed about, had value. Harlan knew it. He had known it before Emmett died, perhaps long before. And he was counting on Clara's grief and desperation to deliver it to him for the price of a month's groceries. Some dormant, iron-hard piece of her own stubbornness, a thing she had believed grief had scoured away entirely, rose up from wherever it had been hiding. She did not know why the land mattered. She did not know what Harlan was after. But she knew with a certainty that went deeper than reason that she would not give it to him, not for any price. Not until she understood what he was willing to conceal in his coat pocket and lie about to her face. Harlan mounted his horse and looked down at her from the saddle, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely, and she saw something cold and calculating in his expression, the look of a man revising a plan. "You'll change your mind before winter." He rode away without looking back. With the last of her money, Clara walked into the general store in town and bought what she needed. A canvas tent surplus, army issue, stained and patched but functional. A shovel with a hickory handle. A pickaxe. A heavy mallet. Rope. Sacks of dried beans, flour, salt, a tin of lard. Matches. A canteen. The total came to nearly everything she had left. And when the last coins crossed the counter, she felt a strange lightness. The unburdened sensation of a person who has finally hit the bottom and discovered that the bottom at least is solid. Margaret Holloway. The woman who owned the store was 60 years old and had been selling supplies to the people of this valley since before the war. She had the sharp cataloging eyes of a woman who had watched 3 decades of human folly pass across her counter, and she recognized the particular kind of purchase Clara was making. This was not a shopping list, it was a survival kit. She rang up each item without comment, her face professionally neutral. But when Clara turned to gather her bags, Margaret slipped 2 additional items into the pile without charging for them: a packet of matches extra and a coil of good rope. She placed them in the bag the way a mother tucks a blanket around a sleeping child, with a tenderness that expected nothing in return. Clara noticed, and their eyes met for a moment. And in Margaret's gaze, Clara saw not the stifling pity of the auction crowd, but something more honest and more painful. The quiet acknowledgement of one woman watching another walk towards something that might kill her, and knowing that words of caution would be both useless and insulting. The climb up to Goat's Folly with 60 pounds of supplies on her back took 3 hours and nearly broke her. The path fought her at every step. The wind pushed her sideways. The ghost tore at her skirts. She stopped 4 times to rest, sitting on cold rocks with her head between her knees, her lungs burning, and her legs trembling. And each time she considered the simple, seductive option of walking back down. Finding the church, accepting the charity that was surely available, living the quiet, diminished life of a woman who had tried and failed. Each time she stood up and kept climbing, not because she was brave, because the alternative was a kind of death that did not require a grave. She pitched the tent in the most sheltered spot she could find. A shallow depression on the lee side of the collapsed bothy, where the standing corner of wall deflected the worst of the wind. The canvas snapped and popped in the ceaseless gusts, a frantic, desperate sound like a bird trapped in a room. She secured the guy ropes with the heaviest stones she could move and crawled inside as the light failed, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders, and waited for the night to do its worst. It did not disappoint. The cold came not from one direction, but from everywhere, seeping up through the ground, pressing in through the canvas, finding every gap between fabric and skin, and exploiting it with the patient thoroughness of water. Finding cracks in stone. The wind was a living thing outside a wolf circling her flimsy shelter, probing, testing, pressing its weight against the canvas walls until they bowed inward, and Clara could feel the shape of the gust, its contours, and its intent. It moaned through the tumbled stones of the ruin, a sound that was not quite human and not quite animal, a chorus of old sorrows given voice by the architecture of collapse. Sleep was a shallow, shivering negotiation. She would drift off for minutes at a time, her exhausted body surrendering despite the cold, only to be snapped awake by a particularly violent gust or the sharp crack of a rope pulling taut. She dreamed in fragments images without narrative. Emmett's face at the wedding. The auctioneer's voice, Harlan's jaw tightening. She woke with the grey dawn feeling as though she had not slept at all. Her body a single continuous ache from the base of her skull to the soles of her feet, and the profound crushing weight of her solitude settled onto her chest like a physical object. She was alone. Not alone in the way that a woman is alone when her husband is away for the day. The temporary, almost pleasant solitude of a quiet house. This was the other kind. The absolute kind. The kind that has mass and texture, and a sound of its own, which is the sound of your own breathing, in an empty space and nothing else. She was alone on a mountain that did not care whether she lived or died, in a place that every sensible person had abandoned, with no one to help her, and no one to hear her, and no plan beyond the next meal and the next bundle of sticks to burn. Her days fell into a grim, necessary rhythm. The most immediate problem was winter. It was already in the air. A sharp metallic tang on the wind, a brittleness in the morning light that had not been there a week ago. The slopes were painted in the drab dying colors of late autumn, the heather going from gray to black, the grass flattening under the first hard frosts. Winter on this mountain was not a gentle season of frosted window panes and picturesque snowfall. It was a siege. It was a predator. It came with the patience of geology and the violence of war, and it killed people routinely, impersonally, without malice or mercy. To survive it, Clara needed two things: shelter that was not a canvas tent, and fuel. The bothy was a ruin impossible to rebuild with one pair of hands and no timber. A new cabin was beyond consideration, requiring lumber nail skills and money she did not possess. That left fuel. Firewood was life, and the slopes around Goat's Folly offered precious little of it. The trees at this elevation were stunted, twisted things. Junipers and wind-tortured pines bent into shapes that looked like pain made visible. They were wood dense and hard, but desperately scarce. For every hour she spent foraging, dragging her aching body across the rocky terrain, with her eyes scanning the ground for any fallen branch, any dead shrub, any piece of organic matter that would burn. She gathered a pathetic bundle of sticks that would feed a fire for 2 or 3 hours at most. It was a losing equation, and she knew it. The third night brought something new. Clara was in her tent, balanced on the edge of an exhausted sleep, when the sound reached her. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, the deer that sometimes pick their way across the upper slopes in the early darkness. These were heavy, deliberate, human. The crunch of a boot on frost-hardened soil, spaced with the even rhythm of a man walking with purpose. They circled the tent, slowly moving from the north side around to the east, then south, pausing at intervals as though the walker was examining the ground or the tent or both. Clara lay rigid in her blanket, her hand closing around the handle of the pickaxe she kept beside her bedroll. Her breath came in shallow, silent pulls. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent flap, perhaps 4 feet from where her head rested on the folded canvas she used as a pillow. She could hear breathing slow and measured the respiration of a man who was not winded from the climb. He had been here before. He knew the path. He stood there for what felt like a full minute, and in that silence, Clara understood something fundamental about her vulnerability. Understood it not as an abstract concept, but as a physical fact. The thinness of the canvas between her body and whatever was on the other side of it. Then the footsteps resumed moving away, not back down the path, but upward toward the higher reaches of a parcel of land, growing fainter until the wind swallowed them entirely. Clara did not sleep again that night. She lay in the darkness with the pickaxe across her chest, listening, and when the gray light of dawn finally leaked through the canvas, she crawled outside and searched the frozen ground around her camp. The footprints were clear in the frost, large boot prints a man's size pressed deep by a heavy frame. They circled the tent exactly as she had heard, paused at the front, then continued uphill toward the crest of the slope where the granite outcrops broke through the surface like dark teeth. Someone had come to her land in the night. Someone who was not interested in her, but in what lay above her or beneath her, or somewhere on this worthless patch of mountain that was not worthless at all. The discovery that changed everything came 4 days later, and it came as the most important discoveries often do, disguised as something trivial. Clara was working through the rubble of the old bothy, prying at the heavy dark stones, in the fading hope of finding old timbers buried beneath the collapse, any piece of wood that had survived the years and the rot, and could be fed to her hungry little fire. The wind was particularly vicious that afternoon, a physical assault that made her eyes stream and turned her fingers into clubs of numb flesh. She had been at it for hours, her shoulders burning, her lower back a solid bar of pain, moving stone after stone, and finding nothing but more stone and the compacted earth of decades. She braced herself against a large flat slab of granite, one of the original foundation stones of the bothy, and heaved. The stone tilted grudgingly, revealing a dark cavity beneath it, a space where the foundation had been dug down to the bedrock. And from that cavity, rising up against her face like a whisper from another world, came a breath of air. It was warm. Not hot, not even truly warm by the standards of a hearth or a stove or a human body. But it was so distinctly, so miraculously different from the air that was biting at her face and freezing the tears on her cheeks that she stopped breathing entirely for a moment, afraid that the sensation was a hallucination born of exhaustion and desperation. She leaned closer, turning her cheek toward the dark opening. There it was again, a slow, steady exhalation from the earth, gentle and persistent, carrying with it the smell of damp soil, of deep, undisturbed stone, of mushrooms and the minerals, and the cold water scent of underground places. It was the smell of a cellar, the smell of the deep-down places of the world where the seasons could not reach. Clara pressed her hand over the opening and felt the air push gently against her palm. A pulse so faint and so steady, it felt less like a draft than like breathing. The earth was breathing. The mountain was exhaling warmth into the killing cold of a Montana autumn. And it had been doing so, she realized, since long before the bothy was built, since long before anyone had thought to name this place or laugh at it. This was not a pocket of trapped air. This was thermal mass. The stored heat of an entire summer captured in the rock and soil of the mountainside and released slowly, imperceptibly into the winter air above it. The memory that surfaced was so sharp and so complete that it felt less like recollection than like transportation. She was 8 years old, sitting on a braided rug in front of a fireplace in her grandmother's house in Lawrence, Kansas. Lenora Braddock, her mother's mother, was a woman built along the same uncompromising lines as the prairie she had spent her life on. She had arrived in Kansas in 1862, a young bride stepping off a wagon onto a landscape so flat and so empty it made her weep. There were no trees on the Great Plains, no lumber, no stone, nothing but grass and wind, and a sky so big it crushed the spirit. The women of Kansas, Lenora among them, had solved the problem of shelter with the only material available. They cut the prairie sod into bricks, heavy blocks of grass-matted earth, and they built houses out of the ground itself. Sod houses, walls of earth, roofs of earth, structures that looked like the land had simply folded itself into a habitable shape. Lenora's voice came back to Clara across 21 years, low and clear, the voice of a woman who had earned every word she spoke. The earth has a slow heart, child. The summer sun sinks deep into the soil, and the rock and the earth holds that warmth long after the sky has turned to iron. The women of Kansas knew this. We had no wood, no brick, no glass to speak of. But we had the earth, and the earth kept us alive. It keeps a secret summer deep in its bones, and if you know how to listen, it will share it with you. Lenora had drawn a picture for her that evening, using a piece of charcoal on the back of a page torn from her Bible. A simple sketch, a cross-section of a sod house showing the thick walls, the low profile, the way the structure was designed to work with the landscape rather than against it. Clara had studied the drawing with the fascinated attention of a child who does not yet know that she is receiving the most important lesson of her life. She had asked questions. How thick were the walls? How did they keep the rain out? What happened when the grass on the roof grew? Lenora had answered each one with the patient precision of a woman who understood that the knowledge she was passing on had been purchased with suffering and was therefore not to be wasted on careless explanations. Now, 21 years later, kneeling in the wind on a barren mountain in Montana with her dead husband's debts around her neck, and nothing in the world but a worthless deed and a pair of raw, bleeding hands, Clara heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Lenora were standing beside her. The earth keeps a secret summer deep in its bones. At the time it had been folklore, a piece of pioneer wisdom preserved in the amber of an old woman's memory. Now it was something else. Now it was a key. The idea that formed in Clara's mind was so wild, so fundamentally contrary to everything the people in the valley below believed about shelter and survival and the proper way to live on a mountain that it made her laugh out loud. The wind snatched the sound from her lips and carried it away, but the laughter kept coming. And it was not the laughter of madness, but the laughter of a person who has been searching for a door in a dark room and has suddenly felt the handle under her fingers. Everyone on this mountain built upward. They reached for the sky. They erected thick wooden walls and shingled roofs and fought the cold with blazing fires that consumed cord after cord of precious wood. They saw the ground as the enemy, the frozen dead thing that sucked the warmth from their hearths and turned their floors to ice. They built on top of it. They fought against it. What if they were all wrong? What if the earth was not the enemy? What if it was the answer? What if the solution was not to stand on top of this mountain and shout defiance into the wind, but to go down, to dig in, to wrap herself in the mountain's own warmth and let its mass do the work that no amount of firewood could accomplish? The collapsed bothy was not a ruin to be cleared. It was a beginning. It was a wound in the earth that she could enlarge. She would not build a house on the land. She would build a house in the land. She would excavate into the slope using the existing depression of the old foundation as her starting point, and she would let the insulating mass of the mountain itself become her walls, her roof, her furnace. She would burrow into the earth like a badger, like a fox, like every animal that understood instinctively what the people in their wooden boxes had forgotten. She would dig her way down to her grandmother's secret summer. The sheer folly of it was obvious. A woman alone with a shovel and a pickaxe and no experience proposing to carve a habitable space out of the side of a granite mountain before the winter snow buried her alive. The townspeople already thought she was mad with grief. What would they think when they saw her digging a hole in the ground and calling it a house? They would call her the Mole Woman. They would shake their heads and lower their voices and say that poor Clara Mercer had finally lost the last of her senses. They would be certain, absolutely certain, that she was digging her own grave. Let them. Their conventional wisdom had led them to build drafty wooden boxes that devoured firewood and trembled in every storm. Their pity kept no one warm. Their charity came with conditions and expiration dates, and the unspoken expectation that the recipient should be properly grateful and properly diminished. Clara had received enough of their pity to know its exact weight and its exact worth, which was nothing. When you have lost everything, when the debts are paid and the furniture is sold, and the husband is in the ground, and the brother-in-law is circling like a vulture with a courthouse petition in his coat pocket, you arrive at a place that most people never reach. It is a terrible place, cold and empty, and stripped of every illusion, but it has one advantage that no amount of comfort can provide. It is the place where you are free, free to fail, free to be mocked, free to try the thing that no reasonable person would attempt, because reason has already done its worst to you, and you are still standing. That night, lying in her tent with the wind howling its endless requiem outside, Clara did not shiver. For the first time in months, the cold could not reach her. She was warmed by something more powerful than fire, more sustaining than food, more dangerous than hope. She was warmed by the heat of an idea, a fierce, desperate, and utterly insane plan that felt in her bones more right than anything she had ever known. A plan that asked her to trust the wisdom of a dead grandmother over the certainty of every living person in the valley. A plan that required her to stop fighting the mountain and start listening to it. The deal was struck in the silence of her own mind, witnessed by no one, binding as blood. She would not run from this place. She would not crawl down to the valley and accept the gentle suffocation of other people's charity. She would not sell her land to a man who wanted it for reasons he was willing to lie about. She would dig. She would descend into the earth, into the darkness, into the place where the mountain kept its slow, secret warmth. And she would survive. Or she would die in the attempt, and at least the grave would already be dug, and at least it would be warm. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the cold ground beneath her bedroll, and she could feel it, faint but real, the distant pulse of heat rising through the rock. The earth's slow heart beating beneath her, keeping its promise, waiting for a hand desperate enough to dig. The work began before dawn. Clara rose in the grey half-light with her body already anticipating the pain, her muscles filing their complaints before she had even stood upright, and she walked to the collapsed bothy with the shovel over her shoulder and the pickaxe in her hand, and stood at the edge of the old foundation and looked down into the rubble-filled depression where she had felt the earth exhale. She did not pause to reconsider. She did not pray. She drove the blade of the shovel into the packed soil and lifted the first load of dirt and stone and tossed it aside, and the sound it made hitting the frozen ground was the sound of a contract being executed. The first week was demolition. The rubble of old Croft's bothy had to be cleared before any meaningful excavation could begin, and the rubble was not cooperative. Decades of frost and thaw had cemented the smaller stones together with a mortar of compacted earth, and each one had to be pried loose individually, the pickaxe biting into the gaps between them, while Clara's shoulders absorbed the shock of metal striking rock. The smaller pieces she could lift and hurl down the slope, where they clattered through the gorse and came to rest among the heather. The larger foundation stones, granite blocks that weighed as much as she did, required a different approach entirely. She learned to leverage the way a child learns language through repetition and failure and the slow accumulation of intuition. Her tools were primitive. A dead birch she found 50 yards down the slope, its trunk straight and hard, about 8 feet long, and thick enough to bear weight without snapping. Smaller stones arranged as fulcrum points. The principle was simple, the execution brutal. She would spend an hour chipping away the packed earth around a foundation block, creating enough space to wedge the birch trunk underneath. Then she would position a fulcrum stone as close to the block as possible and throw her entire weight onto the free end of the lever. Sometimes the granite shifted, a grinding geological groan that vibrated up through the birch and into her arms, and felt like the earth itself acknowledging her effort. More often, nothing happened, and she would have to reposition, dig deeper, find a new angle, try again. A single block could take an entire day to move 3 feet. She did not count the days, she counted the blocks. Her hands, which had been soft from years of domestic work, transformed in the first week into something she barely recognized. Blisters rose and filled and burst, leaving raw craters of exposed skin that wept clear fluid and stung in the cold air like small fires. She tore strips from a spare blouse and wrapped them around her palms, crude bandages that darkened with blood and dirt within hours. The pain was constant. A companion as faithful as the wind, and she learned to work inside it the way a swimmer learns to move inside cold water, not by ignoring it, but by refusing to let it be the most important thing. By the end of the second week, the footprint of the old body was clear. She could see the original foundation, a rectangular depression about 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, dug into the slope where the mountainside dipped to form a shallow bowl. The old builders had excavated down 3 feet to anchor their walls to the bedrock, and this depression became Clara's starting point. She began to dig backward into the slope, extending the rectangle deeper into the mountainside, carving a horizontal tunnel that grew by inches each day. The topsoil was the enemy, frozen and resistant, laced with stones that rang against the pickaxe like dull bells. But below the first 18 inches, the earth changed. It became denser, more uniform packed clay and gravel that yielded to the shovel with a satisfying resistance, and it was warmer, noticeably, measurably warmer. Each foot of depth brought a small but perceptible increase in the stability of the air temperature, as though she were descending a staircase toward a furnace that burned with infinite patience and no flame. She sorted the excavated stones with the eye of a woman who was beginning to see their potential. The large flat-faced granite pieces she set aside in a growing pile near the entrance, recognizing in them the raw material for walls. She had studied the way old Crofts builders had laid the bothy foundation. The careful interlocking of shapes, the way each stone bore the weight of the ones above it and distributed its own weight to the ones below. Dry stone walling, an art that required no mortar, only an understanding of gravity and friction, and the patient willingness to find among 1,000 irregular shapes the two that fit together as though they had been waiting for each other. Her first attempts were clumsy, unstable constructions that collapsed under their own weight. and sent her scrambling backward to avoid the cascade. But each failure taught her something, and by the third week she could feel the balance in her hands, could sense when a stone was seated properly, locked in place by the geometry of its neighbors, bearing its share of the load. The eighth morning brought Gideon Pratt up the slope with a mule and an expression that suggested he had come to witness a disaster in progress. He stood at the rim of the excavation, a man of 50 years, and no wasted words, his face creased by weather and widowhood into a topography of hard-won endurance. His eyes moved across the raw pit, the sorted piles of stone, the crude retaining walls beginning to take shape on either side of the entrance, and something shifted in his expression. A fracture in the skepticism through which a different kind of assessment briefly showed itself. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" Clara straightened from where she had been wedging a stone into the base of the eastern wall. Mud streaked her forehead. Her wrapped hands were dark with earth and old blood. She met his gaze without apology. "Building a house." Gideon looked at the hole, then at her, then back at the hole. "That's not a house. That's a grave with ambition. Ground here freezes 5 feet deep by December. You'll be sealed in ice before the solstice. Harlan's been telling every soul in the valley you've gone out of your mind, and I rode up here to prove him wrong, but this—" He stopped, shaking his head with the slow finality of a man closing a book he did not enjoy. "Come down, Clara. The church will find you a room. There's honest work for a woman willing to sew or keep house. Nobody will think less of you." Clara looked at her ruined hands, then up at the man on the rim. She thought about the room above the church hall. The narrow bed, the donated clothes, the well-meaning conversations conducted in soft voices as though she were an invalid or a child. The word that came to mind was coffin. A clean, warm, respectable coffin lined with the charity of people who would never let her forget that she owed them her survival. She thought about the air rising from the earth, the slow pulse of heat against her palm, the cross-section drawing charcoal on the back of a Bible page. "I appreciate the concern, Gideon, but I'm staying." He stared at her for a long time, the wind pulling at his coat, and whatever he saw in her face was apparently enough to rearrange something inside him. He reached into a memory that he carried closer to the surface than most people knew. "My wife, Nell. She planted lavender on rock soil. Whole valley said she was deranged. Lavender doesn't grow at this elevation, they told her. Wrong soil, wrong climate, wrong everything." He paused, his jaw working. "Best cash crop I ever saw. Better than any potato field I ever broke my back over. I didn't say you're right, Clara. I'm saying I've been wrong before about people who looked wrong." He untied a sack from the mule and dropped it at the edge of the pit. Dense bread, hard cheese, a jar of pickled beets. Then he pulled a pair of heavy leather work gloves from his belt and tossed them down to her. "Your hands are a horror. Use these." He turned the mule and started down the path, then stopped. His voice carried back over his shoulder, rougher stripped of the conversational veneer. "Harlan's been to the county courthouse twice this month. I don't know what for, but you should." He did not wait for a response. He simply walked away, his shoulders set against the wind, a man who had delivered what he came to deliver and wanted no part of the gratitude. The gloves changed everything. They were old and scarred and shaped to someone else's hands. Probably Nell's, and they fit Clara imperfectly. But they shielded the raw skin of her palms and allowed her to grip the tools without the searing pain that had been slowing her progress. She worked longer, dug deeper, moved faster. The food gave her body what it had been burning through, at a desperate rate, calories and substance, and the simple animal reassurance of a full stomach. Gideon did not come back up, but every week she found supplies at the bottom of the path left before dawn. A sack of potatoes, a jug of milk wrapped in burlap. Once a small tin of coffee, a luxury so extravagant she held it in her hands for a full minute before opening it, breathing in the smell like a promise. She was still alone, but the quality of the aloneness had changed. Someone knew she was here. Someone was choosing week after week to carry food up a mountain trail in the dark for a woman he believed was probably going to die. It was not faith. It was something more rare and more practical. it was the refusal to let her be forgotten. Harlan's visits began in the third week. He would appear at the edge of the growing excavation, hands on his hips, his waistcoat buttons straining against a belly that had never known a day of the kind of labor Clara performed every morning before sunrise. His voice carried the particular music of a man who enjoys the sound of his own cruelty. Still at it, Clara, dig much deeper, and you'll shake hands with the devil himself. Though I suppose that's the idea. Trying to get warm. She learned to let his words pass over her, the way the Widowmaker passed over the roof of the earth. She turned her back and focused on the stone in front of her, fitting it into the wall with a precision that grew more confident each day, and her silence was a weapon she had not known she possessed. It denied Harlan the reaction he came for, the flinch, the tears, the cracking voice that would confirm his narrative of a woman coming apart. Each time she failed to break, something in his face tightened and he would leave more abruptly than he arrived, his boots striking the frozen ground with the hard rhythm of a man who is losing a game he thought was already won. In the fourth week, digging near the back wall of the cavern, at a depth of about 4 feet, Clara's shovel struck something that was neither stone nor packed earth. Water. A thin, persistent seep that welled up through a crack in the bedrock, filling the shallow depression her shovel had made with a pool of clear liquid that caught the candlelight and held it. She touched it, expecting the numbing cold of mountain groundwater, and pulled her hand back in surprise. The water was warm, not bathwater warm, not Springs of Yellowstone warm, but distinctly, unmistakably warmer than anything that had a right to be liquid at this elevation in November. It had a faint mineral taste, clean and slightly metallic, the flavor of deep geology. A thermal spring, or the distant relative of one, a thread of geothermally heated water finding its way through the fractured bedrock to the surface. Clara channeled the seep into a natural basin in the rock floor of her cavern, creating a small self-replenishing reservoir. Fresh water slightly warm inside her shelter. She would not have to descend to the valley stream, a round trip of 2 hours over treacherous ground, to fill her canteen. The practical value was immense, but something about the discovery nagged at her, a half-formed thought that connected the warm water to Harlan's hunger for the deed, to the documents in his coat pocket, to the footsteps in the night. The answer came violently at 2 in the morning, when Clara woke to a sound that did not belong to the wind. A sharp, rhythmic striking metal on wood coming from the upper portion of her land. She pulled on her boots and coat and crawled out of the tent into a darkness cut by a quarter moon, and she climbed toward the sound with the pickaxe in her hand and her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound stopped before she reached the crest, but what she found in the moonlight made her drop to her knees. Surveyor's stakes. A dozen of them driven into the frozen ground in a precise line that crossed the upper boundary of her parcel. Professional equipment, the kind used by railroad survey crews, each stake topped with a small red flag that fluttered in the wind like a row of tiny territorial tongues. Someone had been up here with instruments and expertise, measuring, marking, laying claim to the contours of her land with the quiet authority of people who expected no opposition. Clara pulled every stake from the ground and carried them back to her camp in a bundle. She did not sleep. She sat outside her tent with the stakes beside her and the pickaxe across her knees, and watched the eastern sky lighten, and when the sun cleared the ridge, she walked down to town. Margaret Holloway was sweeping the porch of the general store when Clara arrived, and the older woman took one look at Clara's face and set the broom aside and brought her inside and poured her coffee without asking. Margaret had spent 30 years behind that counter, watching the small dramas and large betrayals of valley life, and she had developed an instinct for the moment when a piece of information held too long becomes a kind of cruelty. The railroad. Margaret began before Clara could frame the question. Northern Pacific. They've been surveying a new spur line through the high pass since August. Harlan's been corresponding with their agent in Helena, a man named Garrett, since before your husband died. She let that fact settle, watching Clara's face with the careful attention of a woman who understands that some truths need a moment to find their footing. The locomotives need water, Clara, a reliable year-round water source at elevation. Springs preferably warm enough not to freeze in the pipe. Your Uncle Croft, the one everyone thought was crazy, he found that spring decades ago. It's in his letters. Harlan found the letters in Croft's effects after the old man died. He's known about that water since before Emmett even inherited the deed. Clara set down the coffee cup. Her hands wrapped in their stained bandages inside Nell Pratt's old gloves were trembling, but not from cold. The land isn't worthless. Margaret's face was steady, her eyes holding Clara's with an honesty that was almost aggressive in its directness. That land might be the most valuable parcel on this mountain. Not for the soil, for the water underneath it. And your deed includes mineral and water rights. Harlan knows that too. The shape of it was suddenly terribly clear. Every piece of the puzzle that Clara had been assembling without knowing she was assembling. It snapped into place with an almost audible click. Harlan's patience at the auction, his calculated offer. The documents in his coat pocket, which were almost certainly correspondence with the railroad agent. The nighttime visits to her land, the surveyor's stakes, and now the thing that made the hair on the back of her neck rise, Margaret's next words delivered in a voice that had dropped to barely above a whisper. He's filed papers with Judge Whitfield. He wants to have you declared incompetent, unfit to hold property. His evidence is that you're living in a hole in the ground like an animal, that the whole town calls you the mole woman, and that no person in their right mind would do what you're doing. He's been making sure everyone in the valley calls you that, Clara. He's been building his case in every conversation, in every saloon, at every church social. The name isn't just mockery, it's a legal strategy. Clara walked back up the mountain in a state that was beyond anger, beyond fear, in a territory of the mind, where emotion distills itself into something purer and more dangerous. She had been fighting the mountain. Now she understood that the mountain was the least of her enemies. Harlan was not waiting for winter to prove her wrong. He was using her own survival effort, the very act that was keeping her alive, as the instrument of her dispossession. Every stone she moved, every foot she dug was evidence in his case. The mole woman, the mad woman, the widow who had lost her senses and was living in a hole in the ground. It was elegant in its cruelty, a trap that tightened the harder she struggled. The realization changed the nature of her work. Speed was no longer a preference. It was a legal necessity. The hole in the ground had to become visibly and undeniably a house. A structure that a judge could stand inside and recognize as the product of competence, not collapse. Clara threw herself into the construction with a ferocity that alarmed even her own exhausted body. The retaining walls rose faster, her hands finding the right stones with an instinct that had been trained by 1,000 failures. The cavern deepened its dimensions, becoming more clearly those of a room 10 feet wide, 15 feet deep, the ceiling high enough to stand in at the back where the slope provided natural height. The roof was the critical test. 5 great slabs of granite, each one flat enough to span the gap between the retaining walls and the earthen bank at the rear. She could not lift them. No single person could. But she could move them using the birch lever and stone fulcrums an inch at a time, a process that required the same fundamental understanding that every farmer in Montana possessed, the knowledge that you cannot outmuscle the earth, you can only outthink it. Each slab took 2 to 3 days of incremental progress, levered and rolled, and coaxed across the ground like a stubborn animal, then tilted and slid into position atop the walls. One slip, one miscalculation of angle or fulcrum placement, and the stone would fall and crush whatever was beneath it, which was usually Clara. She worked with a concentration so total it excluded everything else: the cold, the hunger, the constant ache, even the knowledge of Harlan's maneuvering. There was only the stone and the lever. And the next inch. The 5th slab settled into place on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and Clara sat on the ground beside her creation and wept. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, though both were present in quantities that would have felled most people weeks ago. She wept because the 5 slabs, imperfectly fitted with gaps between them that still admitted daylight and wind, formed a roof. An ugly, rough, primitive roof that looked like something from the oldest age of human construction, but a roof nonetheless. She spent the next 4 days filling the gaps with smaller stones, chinked with clay-heavy soil, then packing the entire surface with a thick layer of excavated earth, then cutting turf from the surrounding slope and laying it on top in overlapping sections like enormous shingles. When she finished, the structure was nearly invisible. A low hummock of green turf against the hillside, a dark stone-faced opening in its front, looking less like a building than a natural feature of the landscape. A fold in the earth with a door. Inside, the transformation was complete. The Widowmaker was not merely diminished. It was gone. The moment she crossed the threshold, the sound of the wind dropped from a scream to a murmur, to nothing, replaced by a silence so profound it made her ears ring. The air was still cool but not cold, holding a steady temperature that bore no relationship to the freezing chaos outside. A candle lit and placed on a flat stone burned with a flame so straight and motionless it looked painted. She had built a space that was not a house in any sense the valley would recognize. It was a den, a burrow, a chamber carved from the living rock and insulated by the thermal mass of the mountain itself. It was exactly what her grandmother had described, a structure that worked with the earth instead of against it, and standing inside it for the first time, feeling the quiet and the warmth close around her like a held breath. Clara understood something that the people in the valley, with their timber and their nails and their mountains of firewood, had never grasped. The most powerful shelter is not the one that fights the hardest. It is the one that has nothing to fight. She built a stove from a rusted metal drum scavenged from the gorse, cut an opening for a firebox with the pickaxe, and ran a narrow chimney pipe up through a carefully constructed vent in the roof. The stove was for cooking and for drying the damp air, but she knew it would never be her primary source of heat. That role belonged to the earth. The immense, patient, incalculable mass of stone and soil that surrounded her on 5 sides and asked nothing in return. A bed frame in the far corner, built from deadfall branches lashed with rope. A table and a stool. A door fashioned from the planks of her disassembled packing crate, insulated with layers of canvas and rags, hung on leather hinges cut from Gideon's old gloves when they finally wore through. The whispers in the valley had long since solidified into local legend. She was the mole woman of Goat's Folly, and thanks to Harlan's diligent campaign, the name carried not the rough affection of a nickname, but the clinical weight of a diagnosis. And it was precisely this diagnosis that arrived at her door, in the person of Judge Amos Whitfield, on a bitter morning in the first week of December. Harlan had done his work thoroughly. He stood at the judge's side with 2 witnesses men from town, whose faces Clara recognized from the auction men who had bid on her pots and her quilts, and who now stood with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground, uncomfortable participants in a proceeding they had been told was necessary. Harlan's petition was straightforward. Clara Mercer, widow, was mentally unfit to manage property. She had abandoned civilized habitation. She was living in a hole dug in the ground, exposed to the elements, subsisting on charity. The town could attest to her deteriorating condition. The humane course of action was to place her property under the guardianship of her nearest male relative, which was conveniently Harlan Mercer. Judge Whitfield was a different proposition than Harlan had perhaps anticipated. He was 62, lean, with the kind of face that suggested he had read more books than most men in the territory had seen, and his eyes missed nothing. He climbed the path to Goat's Folly without complaint, examined the exterior of the structure without comment, and then, to Harlan's visible discomfort, asked to go inside. Clara held the door open for him. The judge stood in the center of her earthen room for a full minute without speaking. His eyes moved across the dry stone walls, the fitted roof slabs, the stove with its functioning chimney, the bed, the table, the small shelf where she kept her provisions. He touched the wall with his palm and held it there, measuring the temperature against his own expectation, and his expression shifted. He looked at the seep of warm water in its stone basin. He turned slowly, taking in the complete picture, and when his gaze finally came to rest on Clara, something had changed in it. The skepticism was gone. In its place was a quality of attention that Clara recognized, because it was the same quality she brought to her own stonework, the careful assessment of a person who understands structural integrity. Whitfield stepped back outside into the wind and the cold, and looked at Harlan with an expression that made the larger man take a half step backward. "Mr. Mercer, I see a dwelling, small, unconventional, but structurally sound and reasonably provisioned. I do not see evidence of mental incapacity. I see evidence of considerable resourcefulness. Your petition is denied." Harlan's face went through a series of changes that Clara watched with the detached interest of a naturalist observing an animal in distress. Shock, fury, the rapid recalculation of a man whose primary strategy has just been demolished. He recovered quickly, as men like Harlan always do, and his voice, when it came, had the smooth, reasonable tone of a man playing his reserve card. "Winter hasn't started yet, Your Honor. Wait until January. Wait until the snow buries that hole and the cold cracks those stones apart. Then we'll see what's sound and what's a coffin." Whitfield regarded him for a moment, then turned to Clara. His voice dropped, meant for her alone, though the wind made privacy an unreliable thing. "You've held your ground today, but I'll be honest with you. If this structure fails during the winter, if you are injured, if anything happens that suggests this arrangement is unsustainable, Harlan will refile and I will have considerably less room to rule in your favor. This winter is your trial, Mrs. Mercer. The mountain is your judge, and that court does not grant appeals." He put his hat back on and started down the path, and he did not look back. Clara stood at the entrance to her home and watched the three men descend. Harlan walked with the stiff, jerking gait of a man whose rage was being held on a very short leash. The witnesses hurried ahead, clearly wanting no part of whatever came next. Only Whitfield moved at his own pace, steady and unhurried. A man who had delivered a verdict and was at peace with it. She turned back to face the mountain. The sky above the northern peaks had taken on a color she had never seen before. Not gray exactly, but a greasy yellowish pewter, the color of a bruise in its final stage before it disappears. The wind, which had been blowing steadily all day, suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a coiled spring, the silence of a world bracing itself for something that had been gathering force for 1,000 miles of open sky and frozen plain. Clara knew what that silence meant. Every creature on the mountain knew. The Widowmaker had stopped because it was gathering itself, pulling back like a fist before a blow, marshalling its full and terrible strength for something that would make every storm that had come before it look like a rehearsal. She pressed her hand against the stone doorframe of her shelter and felt the steady warmth of the earth beneath her fingers. Then she went inside, closed the heavy door behind her, and began to prepare. The first flakes arrived like scouts, small and tentative, drifting down from the pewter sky in lazy spirals that seemed uncertain of their purpose. Clara watched them from the doorway, one hand resting on the stone frame, and she noted the way they melted on the dark granite and did not melt on the frozen ground beyond it. The distinction between those two temperatures was everything she had gambled her life on. She brought inside her last bundle of scavenged wood, filled her pot with water from the stone basin, and lit a single candle. Then she sat on her stool with a cup of weak tea between her bandaged palms and waited for the world to end. It came at dusk, not gradually, not with the building crescendo that most storms offered as a courtesy. The blizzard detonated. One moment the flakes were drifting. The next, the air was a solid wall of horizontal ice traveling at a velocity that turned snow into something closer to sand, a scouring white torrent that obliterated the landscape in a single breath. The Widowmaker returned, not as a moan, but as a scream, a frequency of sound that bypassed the ears and registered directly in the chest, in the teeth, in the base of the skull. It was the sound of atmosphere being torn apart and reassembled as a weapon. In the valley, the wooden houses that had stood for decades groaned like ships in heavy seas. The wind found every crack, every imperfect joint, every gap between board and frame, and drove needles of snow through them with a persistence that mocked the families huddled around their hearths. Fires that had been banked for the night roared as drafts fed them oxygen, consuming cordwood at twice the normal rate. And still the cold advanced, a creeping invasion that no amount of fuel seemed capable of repelling. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Ice crystals grew on nail heads. Children were pulled from their beds and brought to the fireside, wrapped in every blanket the household possessed, their small faces pale and frightened in the flickering light. A mile up the valley, Gideon Pratt sat in the kitchen of a farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of his family and listened to it threaten to betray the 4th. The west-facing wall, the one that took the full force of the Widowmaker, was flexing inward with each gust. He could see it, a movement so slight it might have been imagined, except that the dishes on the shelf against that wall rattled with each pulse, a porcelain seismograph recording the assault. The roof beams above his head timbers. He had helped his father hew from lodgepole pine 40 years ago were making sounds he had never heard before. Deep fibrous groans that spoke of stress approaching the limits of the wood's tolerance. Snow was being driven through the window frames in fine glittering powder that accumulated on the sills like white dust and would not be swept away because more arrived to replace it before the broom completed its stroke. His fire was enormous, a conflagration that on any normal night would have turned the kitchen into a furnace, and yet the cold was winning. He could feel it in the floor, in the walls, in the air itself, which seemed to thicken and resist the heat, absorbing it and giving nothing back. His wood pile, stacked against the interior wall enough for a month of normal winter, was diminishing at a rate that made simple arithmetic a source of dread. On the second night, Gideon woke to the sound of something hitting his roof with irregular, heavy impacts, and he realized it was not debris, but the sound of snow compacting under its own accumulating weight, settling and shifting as the load increased beyond anything the structure had been designed to bear. He lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling, and performed the calculation that every man who lives under a wooden roof in snow country eventually performs, the one that weighs the strength of the beams against the density of the snow, against the hours remaining until morning. And the answer he arrived at was not reassuring. The third morning announced itself with a sound like a rifle shot. Gideon was on his feet before the echo died, and he saw it immediately. The main crossbeam, the spine of the entire roof structure, had cracked along its grain. A split ran diagonally across the timber for nearly 4 feet, and as he watched, a section of the attic floor sagged inward, dropping a cascade of snow and splintered wood into the room below. Cold air poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. His fire, which he had fed through the night with the last of his accessible wood, guttered in the sudden draft. The temperature in the kitchen dropped so fast. He could feel it on his face, a physical slap of cold that carried with it the unmistakable message that the house had been breached and could no longer be defended. He stood in his kitchen, 50 years old, in a body that felt 70, and he understood with the plain clarity of a man who has lived close to the land his entire life that he was going to die in this room if he stayed in it. The roof would fail completely within hours. The fire could not be sustained. The cold would do what the cold always did when the barriers fell. It would come in and sit down and wait, and by morning there would be one more frozen body for the spring thaw to reveal. He thought about his wife Nell and the lavender she had planted, and he thought about the way she had smiled when the first purple flowers appeared on the stalks that everyone said would never grow. He thought about that smile for a long time. Then he thought about Clara Mercer. The thought was not rational. It was the blind, grasping impulse of a drowning man reaching for anything that floats. She was probably dead, already buried in her hole on the mountainside, frozen solid in the structure that everyone in the valley had known from the beginning was a tomb. But his house was dying around him, and the town was a mile and a half downhill through what had become an ocean of white, and the woman on the mountain was only a mile uphill, and he had seen her walls, her roof. The warmth held in that earthen room, he had dismissed it. He had called it a grave. But he had felt the temperature inside, and some part of him, the part that had been a farmer, long enough to respect anything that could grow where it was not supposed to, had filed that sensation away, and was now producing it like evidence at a trial. He put on every garment he owned. 3 shirts, 2 coats, a wool scarf wrapped around his face, until only his eyes showed 2 pairs of gloves boots lined with straw. He took up his walking stick, the one carved from an ash limb that his father had given him, when the old man's legs began to fail, and he opened the door of his dying house and stepped into the blizzard. The world was gone. There was no landscape, no horizon, no distinction between ground and sky. There was only white, a churning, roaring, 3-dimensional white that had weight and velocity and intent. The snow came to his waist in the lee of the house, and deeper where the wind had sculpted drifts against every obstacle. Each step was a negotiation with gravity, a lifting of the leg that required the engagement of muscles already burning with cold, a planting of the foot in snow that might be 2 feet deep or 5, a transfer of weight that might find solid ground beneath or might not. The wind hit him like a moving wall, knocking him sideways, and he caught himself with the stick and leaned into it and took another step. He had no compass. He had no visibility. He had only the accumulated knowledge of 50 years on this land, the bone-deep mapping of terrain that a man builds when he walks the same ground through every season of a lifetime. He knew where the slope steepened. He knew where the gorse thickets would provide something to grab. He knew the angle of the ridge against the prevailing wind. He aimed himself at Goat's Folly and began to climb. The journey should have taken 20 minutes on a clear day. It took him close to 2 hours. He fell more times than he could count, the snow swallowing him each time with a soft, almost gentle completeness filling his collar, his cuffs the gaps between his layers, and each time he hauled himself upright with the stick and found his bearing and moved forward. The cold worked on him with the patient methodology of a craftsman. First the extremities, fingers and toes, going from pain to numbness to an absence that was worse than pain, because it meant the tissue was dying. Then the larger muscles, the thighs and shoulders, stiffening, the movements becoming slower, more effortful, each step requiring a conscious decision that grew harder to make as the cold moved inward toward the core. He was on the verge of stopping, not from a decision, but from the simple failure of the machinery. His legs were refusing their instructions. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. The wind was no longer something he fought against, but something he existed inside, a medium as total and as indifferent as deep water. He thought again of Nell, and this time the thought had the quality of an invitation, a door opening onto a warm room where she stood waiting. And he nearly accepted it. He nearly sat down in the snow and closed his eyes and let the white take him. His boot struck stone. The impact jarred his frozen leg and sent him pitching forward, and his hands met the rough surface of a low wall swept mostly clear of snow by the circular eddies of wind that played around the entrance to Clara's shelter. He lay against the wall, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process what his hands were telling him. Stone. Fitted stone. A wall that was not his own. He lifted his head and saw through the driving snow the dark rectangle of a door set into the face of the hillside. No light showed through the cracks. No smoke rose from the buried chimney. The silence behind the door was total and absolute, indistinguishable from the silence of an empty tomb. She was dead. He had killed himself climbing a mountain in a blizzard to die beside a frozen corpse in a hole in the ground. The absurdity of it was so complete it almost made him laugh. But his face was too frozen to manage the expression. He raised his fist and hammered on the planks, a pathetic, muffled sound that the wind erased before it could travel 6 inches. Clara. The word came out as a croak, inaudible even to himself. Clara. He tried once more, the effort draining the last of something essential, some reserve of will that had been keeping his body upright. And he felt himself beginning to slide down the wall, his legs folding the snow already accumulating on his shoulders, beginning the work of burial. The door scraped open. A wedge of warm air and candlelight fell across his face, and it was so utterly contrary to everything the world had been telling him for the last 2 hours that his mind rejected it as hallucination. The air smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. Clara stood in the doorway, calm, steady, holding a candle that burned without the slightest movement in its flame. She looked at the snow-encrusted shape of him, at the ice in his eyebrows, and the frost on his scarf, and the desperation in the only parts of his face that were visible, and she stepped back and held the door open, and the gesture contained everything that needed to be said. He fell inside. The door closed behind him, and the storm became a rumor, a distant muted roar that belonged to a different world. He lay on the dirt floor, shaking beyond control, his body producing violent convulsive tremors as the warmth began the painful process of reclaiming the tissue the cold had tried to take. Clara wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and placed a hot mug of tea in his hands, closing his rigid fingers around it one by one, because he could not manage the grip himself. The room was small, candlelit, warm in the way that the inside of the earth is warm, not with the aggressive consuming heat of a fire, but with the slow, steady, inexhaustible warmth of massive patience of geological time. Gideon lay on the floor of that room and wept. Not from pain, though the pain was considerable, as his extremities began to thaw. Not from relief, though the relief was so acute it bordered on anguish. He wept because he was lying in a place that should not have existed, built by a woman the world had dismissed, and it was saving his life, and he had been among those who dismissed her. The shame of it burned hotter than any stove. When he could speak, the words came out broken, stripped of everything except raw bewilderment. How is this possible? Clara looked at the earthen walls, the stone ceiling, the room that held the storm at bay with nothing more than the weight of the world above it. I listened. The storm held the mountain for 2 more days. When it finally exhausted itself and the wind dropped and the clouds tore apart to reveal a sky so blue it looked enameled, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. 10 feet of snow blanketed the valley. Roofs had collapsed across the settlement. Livestock that had not been brought inside in time were frozen where they stood, grotesque statues in the white landscape. The community emerged from their battered houses blinking and stunned, and the process of counting the cost began immediately. The Hawkins family, Thomas and Ruth, both in their 70s, had run out of firewood on the second night. Their neighbors found them sitting upright in their kitchen chairs, frozen, their hands clasped together on the table between them, their faces peaceful as though they had simply decided to stop and had done so together. The discovery moved through the valley with the weight of a physical blow. The Hawkins had been careful people. They had prepared. They had done everything right by the standards of conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom had killed them. Gideon told his story to anyone who would listen, and everyone listened. His voice carried the fervor of a man who has been shown something that rearranged his understanding of the world. And the details were specific enough and strange enough that they could not be dismissed as the ramblings of an old farmer shaken by a near-death experience. He described the temperature inside the shelter, the silence, the absolute impossible silence of a space that the wind could not reach. The bread Clara had baked in her drum stove, while the greatest blizzard in living memory tried to erase the mountain above her. He described the way the earth held its warmth, the way a mother holds a child without effort, without limit, without expectation of return. He led them up the mountain a week after the storm. A small procession of 8 men who climbed through the deep snow in single file, their hats pulled low, their faces marked by the particular humility that comes from having been humbled by something you did not see coming. They stood at the entrance to Clara's home and looked at each other, and then one by one removed their hats. They entered the shelter and stood in the warm, quiet space, and what filled the room was not merely surprise, but the silence of men confronting the limits of their own assumptions. Harlan was among them. His face was a study in the particular agony of a man watching his own narrative collapse in real time. The mad widow, the mole woman, the pitiable lunatic digging her own grave, was standing in a structure that had outperformed every house in the valley, while requiring less fuel than a single evening's fire in any of their hearths. When he opened his mouth to speak to salvage something from the wreckage of his campaign, Gideon cut him off with a voice that carried the righteous fury of a man who had been saved and who knew exactly who had tried to prevent that salvation. This woman survived on a handful of sticks, while two good people froze to death in a house full of cordwood. Thomas and Ruth Hawkins are dead, Harlan, dead with a month's supply of wood stacked against their wall. That is not luck. That is wisdom, the kind you cannot purchase, the kind that has to be paid for in blood and sweat and the willingness to be called a fool by every comfortable man in the valley. Gideon's eyes held Harlan's, and what passed between them was not a conversation but a sentencing. Including me, and especially you. Harlan left the mountain without another word, but he was not finished. A man like Harlan does not surrender territory, he regroups. Within a week, he had abandoned the incompetency claim entirely and filed a new action. This one aimed not at Clara's mind, but at her title. His argument was simple and ruthless. Emmett Mercer had died owing Harlan a substantial sum. The estate's assets, including the land, should be liquidated to satisfy the debt before any property passed to the widow. The deed, Harlan contended, was his by right of prior claim. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in March, when the roads were passable and the wounds of the blizzard were still raw on the landscape. Clara stood before Judge Whitfield without a lawyer, without money, without anything except the facts and the faces of the people who had climbed the mountain and seen what she had built. Gideon testified first, and his account of the blizzard and his rescue carried the weight of a man who had put his life on the line and had the frostbitten ears to prove it. Margaret Holloway followed, and her testimony was the more devastating of the two because it was not emotional but factual. She laid out with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent 30 years tracking the debts and deals and handshakes of the valley. The timeline of Harlan's correspondence with the railroad agent. The letters had begun before Emmett's death. Harlan had known the value of the water rights for months before offering Clara his pittance at the bottom of the trail. Margaret produced receipts showing that Harlan had purchased surveying equipment from a supplier in Helena. She produced a letter obtained from the railroad agent's office through channels she did not specify, confirming that Harlan had offered to deliver the water rights in exchange for a percentage of the rail line's revenue. He had been selling what did not belong to him before Clara's husband was cold in the ground. Clara presented one final piece of evidence. From the wooden chest that had been her only possession after the auction. The chest containing Emmett's personal effects, she produced a letter. It was written in the crabbed angular hand of Croft Mercer, Emmett's uncle, and it was addressed to Emmett directly, dated 6 months before the old man's death. The language was plain, the intent unmistakable. The letter specified that the land on Goat's Folly, together with all mineral and water rights pertaining thereto, was bequeathed to Emmett Mercer and his wife or surviving heirs. Not to the Mercer family, not to the Mercer estate, to Emmett and his wife. Clara's name was written into the history of that land in ink that predated her husband's death, her husband's debts, and Harlan's ambitions. Judge Whitfield read the letter twice, held it up to the light to examine the ink and paper, and set it down on his desk. His ruling was brief. The land belonged to Clara Mercer. Harlan's claim was dismissed. The courtroom, filled with the same townspeople who had once whispered about the mole woman, erupted into something that was not quite applause, but was louder and more genuine, a collective exhalation of breath. The sound of a community recognizing that it had been wrong, and choosing for once not to look away from that recognition. Harlan stood alone in the emptying courtroom, his face the color of tallow. And when he walked out through the double doors and into the March sunlight, he walked out of the valley and out of the story, a man diminished not by defeat, but by the exposure of a smallness that had always been there, hidden beneath the waistcoat and the handshake and the knowing smile. Spring came to Montana the way it always does, violently. The snow retreating up the mountainsides in a ragged line as the lower slopes exploded into mud and meltwater and the first savage green of new growth. Clara emerged from her shelter into a world that was loud with running water and birdsong, and she stood in the doorway and let the sun touch her face and look down at her hands. They would never be the same. The months of work had reshaped them permanently. The fingers thickened and slightly curved, the knuckles swollen, the joints stiff in the mornings and aching in the cold. She had lost 2 toes on her left foot to frostbite during the weeks in the tent before the shelter was complete, and she walked now with a slight permanent limp that would be with her for the rest of her life, a hitch in her gait that was the mountain signature on her body, proof of the price she had paid for admission to its secrets. The stronger hands, the damaged foot, the new lines around her eyes, and the gray that had appeared in her hair over a single winter. These were the marks of a transaction, and she did not resent them. A thing that costs nothing is worth nothing, and what she had gained was worth every broken blister, every frozen night, every moment of doubt that had threatened to send her crawling down the path to the valley, and the stifling mercy of other people's pity. But there was a cost she had not anticipated, one that could not be measured in damaged tissue or lost digits. She had become harder. The woman who had stood at the auction and watched her wedding pots sold to strangers. The woman who had cried in the dark tent and been afraid of footsteps, that woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had stared down a mountain and a blizzard and a brother-in-law and a judge and had not broken, and the not breaking had changed the composition of her interior life. She was less afraid, but she was also less soft. She could endure more, but she felt certain things less acutely. She had traded vulnerability for endurance, and on most days the trade seemed fair. But on some evenings, sitting alone in her shelter, with the candle burning its steady flame, she missed the woman she had been before. The way you miss a friend who moved away and stopped writing. 3 families whose homes had been destroyed by the blizzard came to her that spring, hats in hands, and asked her to teach them. She said yes without hesitation, and the work of building began again. But this time she was not alone. She stood alongside men and women who dug into the slope and fitted stones, and learned through their own hands what she had learned through hers, and the knowledge passed between them, not as instruction, but as contagion. The way fire passes from one torch to another without diminishing the first. The new shelters were improvements on her original design, incorporating lessons from the winter. They dotted the slope of Goat's Folly like natural features of the terrain, green-roofed and stone-faced, nearly invisible from a distance, as though the mountain had consented to be inhabited and had shaped itself accordingly. Gideon was there for all of it. Not as a laborer, his body was still recovering from the damage of his blizzard crossing, but as the man who carried supplies and organized work crews and stood at the edge of the excavation, offering unsolicited opinions about stonework that were usually wrong and occasionally useful. He and Clara developed the kind of companionship that exists between two people who have saved each other's lives and do not need to discuss it, a bond built not on romance or obligation, but on the simple, irreducible fact of shared survival. Whether it became something more was a question the valley occasionally debated, and Clara and Gideon never addressed, because some things are diminished by naming them, and what they had was sufficient and did not require a label to hold its shape. The mineral spring on Clara's land became the subject of a negotiation that revealed more about her character than any amount of testimony could have. The railroad still wanted the water. The water still had value. Clara could have sold the rights and lived comfortably for the rest of her life. Instead, she negotiated an arrangement that gave the community access to the spring in perpetuity, a shared resource managed by the people who lived on the mountain, funded by a modest fee from the railroad that went into a common fund for repairs and supplies. It was the exact opposite of what Harlan had intended, the transformation of a private asset into a public good, and it cemented Clara's position in the community not as a landowner, but as something more durable. A person who understood that the only wealth worth having is the kind that survives your death. Goat's Folly was no longer a punchline. It was a place. The years accumulated the way snow accumulates on a roof invisibly, at first then with a weight that changes the structure beneath. Clara Mercer lived on that mountain for 53 years. She watched the community she had inadvertently founded grow from 3 shelters to a dozen, the turf roofs greening each summer, like a constellation of small emerald islands on the grey slope. She delivered babies and buried neighbors, and taught children how to read the grain of a stone and find the angle where gravity becomes an ally instead of an adversary. Her hands grew stiffer with each passing year, the joints finally locking into their permanent shape, curved and thick, the hands of a woman who had moved mountains one stone at a time. Her limp deepened. Her hair went completely white. But her eyes kept the same quality they had possessed on the day she refused Harlan's offer at the bottom of the trail. The quality of a person who has seen through the surface of things and is no longer impressed by what the surface has to say. She died on a spring morning in 1942, sitting in a chair outside her shelter, with a cup of coffee in her crooked hands, and the sun on her face and the valley spread out below her, like a painting that she had spent a lifetime learning to read. The Widowmaker was blowing as it always was, but it passed over the turf roof of her home the way a river passes over a stone in its bed, acknowledging the obstacle without being troubled by it. She was 82 years old, and she had outlived her grief and her debts and her enemies and most of her fears, and the one thing she had not outlived was the mountain which would be there long after every shelter and every name and every story had returned to the earth from which they came. They buried her on the slope near the entrance to the original shelter, and Gideon Pratt, who had died 15 years before her, lay 50 yards away under a marker that read only his name and dates, because he had specified in his will that he wanted no epitaph, that the facts of a life should be sufficient without editorial. The community she had built continued for decades. The earth-sheltered houses passing from generation to generation, each one modified and improved, but built on the same fundamental principle that Clara had discovered on a freezing afternoon with her cheek pressed to a hole in the ground. The principle that the earth remembers what the air forgets, that the deepest warmth is the quietest, that the most powerful act of defiance is not to stand against the storm, but to step out of its path and let it exhaust itself against the empty air where you used to be. The story was told and retold around fires on cold nights. The way all stories that matter are told imperfectly, with embellishments and omissions, each teller adding something and losing something. The living current of narrative, reshaping the facts into something that was truer than accuracy. It became a story about the nature of value, about the difference between what something looks like and what it is, about the quiet subversive power of listening in a world that rewards shouting. The greatest treasures do not glitter. They lie buried in the dark, patient as geology, waiting for a hand desperate enough to dig and a heart brave enough to trust in the warmth of the earth's secret summer.